Thank you very much, Carlos, for your lecture. I
Of
like
course.
particularly the Looney Tunes at the end.
Yeah.
Just to respond to an inquiry in the chat,
Mhm.
a recording of this lecture will be uploaded afterwards, I believe, Joe, to the History Department's YouTube page. Is that correct?
Yes, it's if you just search up on YouTube users College of Staten Island History Department, you'll find our page with our videos there. I'll post a link in the chat as well.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, thank you very much, Carlos, for your lecture again. Now we will now invite questions, please. We will continue to invite questions and answer questions until this session closes at 3:30. As I've written into the chat, could you please type your questions into the chat, and then Professor Frushi and I will alternate at reading them for our speaker, who can then respond to your questions. Thank you. All right, I will start by reading the first question to appear in our chat today. And it's from Professor Susan Smith-Peter. And Professor Smith-Peter writes, I am curious to hear more about Operation Bootstrap. Was it used to enforce policies on vulnerable populations? Question mark.
Yes, to a very high degree. Operation Bootstrap wasn't just necessarily, it was a vehicle to try to transform the economy in Puerto Rico, but it also became a method of, I'm trying to find the right words here. It became the method in which government and private interests kind of aligned themselves to have a relationship that benefited both sides. So in a way, vulnerable people were affected by this. And there's actually, in the 1970s and 80s, there's like a real yearning among Puerto Ricans about the countryside, because industrialization happened so quickly, and farming and agriculture had been left behind. A lot of these vulnerable people had to move into the city, and in some ways didn't necessarily get the opportunity that they thought they were going to get in the city. So there were a lot of, it was a domino effect once Operation Bootstrap did come into play of, yes, we're industrializing, but we're changing the very fabric of how these people live. And some people stood to benefit and some obviously didn't.
Thank you, Carlos. Professor John Dixon has a question. He congratulates you on the success at your position and thanking you for a fascinating talk, but he's eager to know more about the role of religion in shaping U.S. attitudes and policies toward Puerto Rico. Did anti-Catholicism inform U.S. misperceptions of Puerto Rico? Did debates over the potential Americanization and whiteness of Puerto Ricans intersect with religion at all?
That's a great question. In researching, I did find some clear Catholicism like threads. So that was present, but I don't think that the main issue was Catholicism itself. It was more so that Catholicism meant that it was tied to the Spanish Empire. Like I mentioned in the first part of this presentation, there were a lot of discussions on whether or not, are we an imperial power, and how are we going to justify trying to colonize Puerto Rico and find ways in justifying it. But yeah, it was mostly, I wouldn't say it wasn't as much anti-Catholicism sentiments as it was anti-Spanish sentiments, so to speak. that played a much bigger role in, moving forward. But interestingly enough, I didn't really get into it in that last section there. But as as tourism started to increase throughout the 50s and 60s, this Spanish colonial pass was actually used as a marketing method to try to get people to come to Puerto Rico. So it wasn't just a tropical paradise, it was a playground to see how it was becoming an American foothold, and also a place that was exotic because it was tied to this past, this very visceral past that can be seen physically through places in Old San Juan. You see those castles and El Morro and whatnot. So yeah, there was a fairly interesting dynamic there about the Spanish that obviously goes into anti-Catholicism, but I would say it was more so that aspect of it.
Thanks, Carlos. Our next question in the chat is from Professor Jonathan Sassy. He writes, "Thanks, Carlos. It's nice to see you again, and I enjoyed your talk. How did large-scale immigration of Puerto Ricans to the US mainland, especially to New York City after World War II, shape the image of the island that you're talking about?"
It played a very big role. And as you saw, I didn't really get into the Puerto Rican perspective purposely, because I was just trying to focus on American writers and how the foreign policy affected the discourse. But there was talk amongst Puerto Ricans that did migrate to New York City in particular. As we know, once World War II ended, there was an influx of Puerto Ricans that moved into New York City. But what ended up happening when they moved there was, deindustrialization started to happen throughout American cities. So they weren't necessarily finding as many jobs as they would have hoped as they came into Puerto Rico. So cities, we're going to go through, decades long problems in Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans were at the forefront of kind of keeping city centers together, but they did contribute to the image of how Americans viewed the island, just due to the fact that Puerto Ricans were actually like going back and forth between the island. I always find my dad's stories very interesting. He used to tell me that, my grandma, it would be, 1 a.m. and she said, let's go to Puerto Rico. And, in a few hours, they were already in Puerto Rico. Like, there were some people that would do that in flying back and forth between the island. And in that, you get this interesting mix of culture and also music. A lot of people were interested in Latin jazz and the likes, and that that also played a role in how people viewed the island, and Puerto Ricans were at the forefront of music and jazz in places like Harlem, the Bronx, and what have you.
Thank you, Carlos. We have another question from Judith King. She starts off by thanking you for this interesting presentation. She's curious about the role of Puerto Rican military personnel in World War I, since it was so soon after 1898.
That's a really good question. I'm actually not well versed. I wish I could answer that question in real detail. It is a good question, since, like you said, it's close to 1898, and there are some there